On April 5, 1976, a private jet streaked across the Mexican coastline, screaming toward Houston, Texas. Inside the pressurized cabin, a team of doctors and aides huddled around a man who looked less like a human and more like a relic. He was 6'4", but he weighed barely 90 pounds. His hair and beard reached his waist. His fingernails were curled, talons of neglect. Before the wheels touched the tarmac, the man was dead. He was so unrecognizable that even though aides identified him, the authorities called in the FBI to run a fingerprint analysis on the John Doe. The fingerprints confirmed the impossible. This wasn't a drifter. This was Howard Robard Hughes, Jr., the man who owned the sky, the man who shaped Hollywood, and the man who at that moment was one of the richest men in America. But as his body grew cold, a $2.5 billion bomb was about to detonate. Howard Hughes was a man obsessed with control, yet he had committed the ultimate sin of the wealthy. He had left no instructions for his empire, no map, no heirs, and, apparently, no will. To understand why the Mormon will caused such a national earthquake, we first have to understand the man who became a ghost while he was still alive. In his youth, Howard Hughes was the American dream. He inherited his father's tool company and turned it into a money-printing machine. He built the fastest planes, produced the most scandalous movies like The Outlaw, and romanced icons like Katharine Hepburn and Ava Gardner. He was the aviator. But by the late 1950s, the dream turned into a paranoid nightmare. Hughes suffered from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder in an era when it wasn't understood. He retreated. For the last 20 years of his life, Hughes lived in total isolation. He moved between darkened penthouses in Las Vegas, the Bahamas, and Managua. He lived in what he called a sterile zone. He sat naked in darkened rooms, watching the same movies over and over again. He communicated with his aides through thousands of typed memos, many of them outlining bizarre rituals for opening a door or handling a spoon. He hadn't been seen in public for nearly 2 decades. Think about that. For 18 years, the world's most powerful businessman was a phantom. His companies, worth billions, were run by a small group of Mormon aides who were the only humans allowed to see him. This isolation was the perfect breeding ground for what was coming next, because if no one had seen the billionaire in 20 years, who could truly say what he had written in private? The moment the news of Hughes's death was official, a legal gold rush began. His company, Summer Corp, knew they were in trouble. If there was no will, the control of his casinos, his aircraft plants, and his real estate would fall into the hands of the state. Lawyers descended on his penthouses like forensic teams at a crime scene. They dismantled his desks. They checked the linings of his suits. They opened every safe deposit box from Los Angeles to Houston. They found strange things. They found memos written on Kleenex. They found millions of dollars in uncashed checks stuffed into old boxes. They found maps to gold mines, but they found no will. In the United States, if you die without a valid will, you die intestate. This means you have essentially surrendered your life's work to a government-mandated formula. Usually, the money goes to your spouse. If no spouse, it goes to your children. If no children, it goes to your parents. But Howard Hughes had none of those. He was an only child. His parents were long dead. He was twice divorced with no acknowledged children. Under the laws of Nevada and Texas, if no closer family could be found, his fortune would be split among his next of kin, cousins he hadn't spoken to in 40 years. The estate was a $2.5 billion vacuum. And in the world of inheritance, a vacuum always pulls in the desperate, the greedy, and the imaginative. The search for the will had become a national obsession. Then, 3 weeks after the funeral, a yellow envelope appeared in Salt Lake City, and the phantom of the desert finally spoke from the grave. Or did he? The battle lines were drawn. The Mormon will was about to be revealed, and with it, a name that would become synonymous with one of the greatest legal mysteries in history: Melvin Dummar.
On April 27, 1976, exactly 22 days after Howard Hughes's body was identified, a mail clerk at the headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was sorting through the daily heap of donations and correspondence. Among the bills and letters sat a plain yellow legal-size envelope. There was no return address, no wax seal, no hint that the contents were worth more than the building it sat in. It was simply addressed to the president of the church. When the envelope was opened, the world stopped spinning for a moment. Inside were 3 pages of yellow legal pad paper, covered in a shaky, sprawling script. It began with a sentence that made the clerk's blood run cold. I, Howard R. Hughes, being of sound mind and disposing mind and memory. This was the Mormon will, the holy grail that hundreds of lawyers had spent weeks hunting for in the hotel rooms of Acapulco and the vaults of Las Vegas. It hadn't been buried in a safe. It hadn't been hidden in a Swiss bank. It had apparently been dropped into a public mailbox. To understand the chaos that followed, you have to understand a specific piece of American law, the holographic will. In many states, including Nevada and Utah, a will doesn't have to be typed by a lawyer or stamped by a notary to be legal. If it is written entirely in your own handwriting and signed by you, it is considered a holographic will. For a man like Howard Hughes, a man who trusted no one, a man who lived in total seclusion, a holographic will made perfect sense. It was the ultimate private act. But in the world of high-stakes probate, a holographic will is also a target. Because there are no witnesses to the signing, the only proof of its validity is the handwriting itself. The Mormon will was dated March 19, 1968. If it was real, it meant that for 8 years, Howard Hughes had carried his final wishes on a piece of scratch pad paper. As the contents of the will were leaked to the press, the legal community began to scratch its head. The bequests were a strange mix of high-level philanthropy and personal grudges. The will broke down the billions like this. 1/4 was to go to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, ensuring his legacy in science. 1/8 was split between the University of Texas, Rice University, the University of Nevada, and the University of California. 1/16 went to the Mormon Church. 1/16 was left to his 2 ex-wives, Ella Rice and Jean Peters. But then the document took a turn into the bizarre. It named Noah Dietrich as the executor of the estate. This was a massive red flag. Dietrich had been Hughes's right-hand man for decades, but the two had suffered a legendary bitter falling out in the late 50s. They hadn't spoken in years. Why would Hughes leave his empire in the hands of a man he allegedly despised? And finally, there was the name that would launch 1,000 headlines. Tucked between the universities and the ex-wives was a provision for 1/16 of the total estate, approximately $156 million, to be given to a man named Melvin Dummar. Who was Melvin? He wasn't on the board of any Hughes companies. He wasn't a cousin. He wasn't a Hollywood star. He was a gas station attendant in a tiny town in the middle of the desert. The question on everyone's lips was, why would the world's most powerful man leave a $100 million fortune to a stranger who sold gas and snacks? The discovery of the Mormon will wasn't the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of a war. To find the truth, investigators had to go into the heart of the Nevada desert to find a man who claimed he had saved the life of a billionaire with a quarter and a ride in a Chevy. As news of the Mormon will broke,
The world's media descended on the tiny town of Willard, Utah, and the dusty outposts of Gabbs, Nevada. They were looking for one man, Melvin Dummar. Melvin wasn't a titan of industry. He was a dreamer whose luck always seemed to run out just before the finish line. He had been a delivery driver, a magnesium plant worker, and was currently struggling to keep a small gas station afloat. He was a part-time country songwriter who had once appeared on The Gong Show. He was the last person on Earth anyone expected to be a billionaire's beneficiary. When the cameras finally found him, Melvin didn't look like a man who had won the lottery. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, and according to him, he had. Melvin's story began late on a cold December night in 1967. He was driving south on U.S. Highway 95, heading toward Las Vegas. About 150 miles north of the city, near a desolate area called Lida Junction, Melvin pulled over to the side of the road to relieve himself. As he stepped out into the biting desert air, his headlights caught something in the dirt. It was a man. He was lying face down, shivering, wearing nothing but a thin hospital-style gown. He was filthy, with matted hair and a scraggly beard. Melvin, thinking he had found a homeless man or a victim of a carjacking, helped the stranger into his Chevy. He turned up the heater and offered the man a cigarette. The stranger was mostly silent, huddled against the door. Melvin asked where he wanted to go. The man whispered, "The Sands Hotel in Las Vegas." During the 3-hour drive, the stranger asked Melvin for a few coins to make a phone call once they arrived. Melvin reached into his pocket and handed over the loose change he had. As they pulled up to the rear entrance of the Sands, the man finally turned to Melvin. In a quiet, raspy voice, he said, "I want to thank you for saving my life. I'm Howard Hughes." Melvin laughed. He told the man, "Sure you are, and I'm the Pope." He watched as the disheveled figure vanished into the hotel. For 9 years, Melvin told this story as a joke, a tall tale about the crazy drifter who thought he was the richest man in the world. He had no idea that while he was struggling to pay his mortgage, the man in the passenger seat had allegedly been writing him into a billion-dollar legacy. It was a perfect American story, the Good Samaritan rewarded beyond his wildest dreams. But in the world of probate law, perfect stories are usually the first ones to be dismantled. As the FBI and private investigators hired by the Hughes estate began to dig, the Mormon will began to look less like a miracle and more like a crime scene. First was the delivery. Melvin originally claimed he had no idea how the will got to the LDS headquarters, but then investigators found a single clear thumbprint on the yellow envelope. It didn't belong to a mysterious messenger, it belonged to Melvin Dummar. Melvin's story shifted. He admitted he had delivered the envelope, but claimed he only did it because a mysterious man in a suit had dropped it off at his gas station with instructions to take it to Salt Lake City. Then came the investigation into Melvin's family. It was discovered that Melvin's wife, Bonnie, worked for a magazine company called Millionaire that was distributed to wealthy Americans and had access to Hughes' memos and signatures. Suddenly, the shaky handwriting on the will didn't look like the tremors of a dying billionaire. It looked like a meticulous, nervous forgery. The battle for the Hughes billions was no longer about a desert rescue. It was about to become a war of experts. We step into the courtroom for the trial of the century, where a misspelled nickname and mismatched handwriting would finally sink the Mormon will. By 1977, the Mormon will was no longer a curious news item. It was the center of a legal hurricane. The trial to determine its validity became one of the most expensive and publicized probate battles in American history. On one side was Melvin Dummar, represented by lawyers who smelled a $100 million contingency fee. On the other side was Summa Corporation, the massive holding company that controlled Hughes's empire, and a phalanx of the most expensive attorneys money could buy. The burden of proof was heavy. In Nevada, a holographic will is presumed valid if it can be proven that the signature and the material provisions are in the handwriting of the deceased. But how do you prove the handwriting of a man who hadn't signed a public document in 20 years? The trial quickly devolved into what lawyers call a battle of the experts. Melvin's team brought in esteemed document examiners who argued that the shaky, uneven lines in the Mormon will were a perfect match for a man suffering from the neurological decay and isolation Hughes endured in 1968. They argued that a forger would have made the writing too perfect. This messiness was proof of authenticity. But the defense was ready. They pointed to the glaring spelling errors. Howard Hughes was an obsessive perfectionist who had personally edited technical manuals for aircraft. Would he really misspell the word children? Would he really misspell the name of his closest associate, Noah Dietrich? Then the defense dropped a bombshell about the yellow notepad. They discovered that the 3 pages of the will hadn't been written at the same time. Microscopic analysis showed that the ink on page 1 had a different chemical composition than the ink on page 3. It suggested the document was a Frankenstein creation, pieced together from different sittings or different people. But the true death blow to the Mormon will didn't come from handwriting or spelling. It came from a chemist working in a paper mill. Forensic investigators analyzed the physical properties of the legal pad paper itself. In 1976, paper manufacturing was more sophisticated than people realized. Every brand had a unique fingerprint based on its fiber content and the chemicals used to make it white. The Mormon will was written on paper from a specific manufacturer. Under a spectrographic analysis, scientists found a specific optical brightener, a chemical used to make the paper appear whiter under fluorescent light. They traced this chemical to its source and discovered a terrifying truth for Melvin Dummar. That specific chemical compound was not used by that paper manufacturer until 1971. The will was dated March 19, 1968, but the paper it was written on didn't exist until 3 years later. Howard Hughes might have been a visionary, but he wasn't a time traveler. He could not have written his final wishes on paper that hadn't been invented yet. With the future paper evidence on the table, the jury didn't need much more time. The Mormon will was exposed as a fabrication. But the verdict wouldn't just crush Melvin's dreams. It would hand the keys of the empire to a group of people who didn't even know they were in the race. The forgery was proven, but the money didn't just vanish. Without a will, the billions were now a prize for anyone with a drop of Hughes's blood in their veins. In the next chapter, we meet the laughing heirs, the cousins who hit the world's biggest lottery without ever buying a ticket. In June 1978, the verdict was official. The Mormon will was a forgery. In the eyes of the law, the document was nothing more than 3 pages of expensive scrap paper. But while the public was fixated on Melvin Dummar's downfall, the legal system was facing a terrifying reality. By striking down the Mormon will, the court had officially declared Howard Hughes intestate. For a billionaire, this is the ultimate failure. It meant that every decision regarding his $2.5 billion empire, every casino, every secret aircraft patent, every acre of Las Vegas land would now be governed by the rigid, unfeeling machinery of Nevada state law. When a person dies without a will, the law doesn't care about their intent. It doesn't care who they liked, who they worked with, or who they promised a fortune to over a drink in 1950. It only cares about one thing, the bloodline. Because Hughes had no wife, no children, no parents, and no siblings, the search for heirs had to move backward up the family tree and then back down into the distant branches. The court-appointed administrators began a global hunt for anyone who shared a drop of Hughes's blood. What followed was one of the most exhaustive genealogical searches in human history. The estate hired dozens of private investigators and genealogists to track down every living descendant of Howard Hughes's grandparents. They searched birth records in Texas, marriage certificates in Louisiana, and death notices in California. They found people living in trailers, people working in middle management, and people who had no idea they were related to the most famous recluse in the world. In total, they identified 22 cousins. These were the people who would become known in the legal textbooks as the laughing heirs. In probate law, a laughing heir is a relative so distantly related to the deceased that they feel no grief over the death, only the joy of a sudden, unearned windfall. Most of these 22 people hadn't seen Howard Hughes in 30 or 40 years. Some had never met him at all. One cousin reportedly had to be told who Howard Hughes was when the lawyers called. Yet, by the stroke of a pen, they were now the most powerful group of heirs in America. The inheritance wasn't just a check in the mail. It was a burden that many of the cousins weren't prepared for. Because there was no centralized plan, the 22 heirs became a fractured committee. They didn't agree on how to run the casinos. They didn't agree on how to handle the massive tax bills looming from the IRS. This is the hidden tragedy of the Hughes inheritance. Because Hughes failed to use basic tax planning tools, like a living trust or a charitable foundation, the U.S. government became his largest heir. The IRS and the states of Texas and California swooped in, claiming up to 70% of the estate's value in death taxes. While the laughing heirs were technically billionaires on paper, they spent the next several years in a different kind of prison, a prison of litigation. They were sued by the fake heirs who refused to give up. They were sued by the states. They were even sued by each other. Howard Hughes had spent his life building a fortress of privacy. But because he died intestate, he handed his 22 distant cousins a map to a treasure chest that was already on fire. The cousins had won the battle, but the war for the Hughes legacy was far from over. In our final chapter, we look at the long-term wreckage of this estate, the tragic end of Melvin Dummar, and the one lesson every person watching this needs to learn before it's too late. While the 22 cousins were busy dividing the billions, Melvin Dummar returned to the life he had tried to escape. He was never charged with forgery. There wasn't enough evidence to prove he was the one who penned the will, only that he possessed it. But in the court of public opinion, he was a marked man. He became a punchline, the man who almost had $150 million. He spent the rest of his life working as a delivery driver and a property manager. Yet, until his death in 2018, Melvin never wavered. He told anyone who would listen that he did save Howard Hughes that night in 1967. He even saw himself portrayed in the 1980 Oscar-winning film Melvin and Howard. But even that Hollywood glamour couldn't pay the bills. Melvin died claiming he was a victim of a system that favored corporate lawyers over a desert-dwelling Good Samaritan. Whether he was a brilliant con artist or a pawn in a larger game, his name is forever etched into the history of American probate law as a warning. Without a valid will, your story is whatever the court says it is. The Howard Hughes estate didn't just end with a check, it ended with an erosion. It took nearly 35 years to fully close the books. By the time the final cousin received their final distribution in 2010, the billion-dollar estate had been eaten alive by three main predators. First, there were the death taxes. Because Hughes didn't have a tax shelter plan, the IRS and the states of Texas and California took the lion's share. Second, there were the legal fees. Over 200 lawyers worked on this case across 4 decades. At one point, the estate was paying out millions per month just to keep the lights on in various courtrooms. And finally, there was the administrative waste. Because the 22 cousins couldn't agree on business strategies, many of Hughes's companies were sold off at fire sale prices or allowed to stagnate. A legacy that was meant to change the world of science and aviation was instead liquidated to pay for the fight over its remains. Howard Hughes spent his entire life obsessed with privacy. He spent millions to be invisible. But because he failed to write a simple, witnessed will, he guaranteed that his most private details, his health, his drug use, his relationships, would be dragged through the public record for 30 years. This is the inheritance verdict for all of us. You don't need billions for your estate to become a horror story. Lesson 1. Silence is a void. If you don't name your heirs, the state will. And the state doesn't care about your friendships, it only cares about your bloodline. Lesson 2. The myth of the holographic will. Just because a handwritten note can be legal doesn't mean it should be your plan. As the future paper proved, science will find the cracks in your story. Lesson 3. Plan for the vultures. A clear, witnessed, and notarized will is the only shield your loved ones have against laughing heirs and fake claimants. Howard Hughes conquered the skies, but he was defeated by a yellow legal pad. Don't let your legacy be a question mark in a desert road. What would you do if you were one of those 22 cousins? Would you take the money and run, or would you feel like a thief in a dead man's house? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see how the estate of Prince or Huguette Clark fell into similar traps, click the playlist on your screen now. I'm your host, and this has been Inheritance Verdict. Secure your legacy before someone else tries to write it for you.